As you can see, it is Halloween here. Halloween is my absolute favorite time of the year, so I'm super excited to get started with this content. Today's case definitely fits in that October Halloween vibe, and it's very likely that you're probably new to my channel, so I will introduce myself. My name is Summer Sanchez, and this channel is all about true crime, cults, and something I call heinous history, which are just really old crime cases that I find fascinating. And for the month of October, all of my content will be centered around cases that I find extra creepy. So if any of that sounds like something that you might be interested in, please consider subscribing to my channel. And today I'm bringing you another cult case, and oh my God, is it a crazy one? Literally the stuff of nightmares. And I knew that I wanted to cover this cult at some point, and the more I researched it, the more it felt like a case that should be told in October. The acts that this cult participates in literally sounds like something from a horror film. And as you can probably tell from the title and the thumbnail of this video, there's a lot of vampire-like activity that goes on in this case. Today, I'm going to be telling you the story of how 18-year-old sex worker Magdalena Solis became an evil, sadistic cult leader essentially overnight, and how she went on to manipulate an entire village of people to commit absolutely horrific acts. So grab a coffee, maybe grab some wine, maybe nothing red though. I've got my London fog here. And sit back, relax, and let's talk about Magdalena Solis, the high priestess of blood, and her cult of vampires. So we're opening up today's case in the very tiny village of Yerba Buena in Mexico in the 1960s. Yerba Buena was situated right at the edge of the Sierra Madre Mountains, and it was so tiny at this point in the 60s that it could barely even be classed as a village. It was really more of a communal farming village. It was super small. There were only about 20 or so families living there at the time. The population was less than 100 at this point in the 1960s. So it was super tiny. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew what everyone was doing pretty much at all times. And the small number of families that were living there had actually been sent there to establish farmland in this area of Mexico by the Mexican state of Guanajuato. And I sincerely apologize for any words that I'm definitely going to mispronounce in this video. So the villagers, for the most part in Yerba Buena, have been described as being very uneducated, mostly illiterate, extremely economically disadvantaged, and they were completely isolated in this little village in Mexico. They were pretty much all by themselves in this area. The vibe that I got when I was researching this was that they were all extremely skilled when it came to agriculture. Like they were really good at that kind of stuff, but they hadn't been really formally, like classically educated, if that makes sense. And because Yerba Buena was so tiny, they didn't really have anything like local government or police stations or schools even. It's also been said that there was no running water, no telephone, and no electricity in this village. They were just this very small group of people living in this very isolated area of Mexico, pretty much living by their own rules. And luckily for the villagers of Yerba Buena, the land there proved to be very fertile. So they very quickly began to grow beans and corn, and then they would harvest this and then take it to market to sell. And this was how the villagers made their living, but there really wasn't a lot of money in this, so they still struggled quite a bit. And because you know that this is a cult case, I'm sure a lot of you are already thinking, okay, we have this very small group that's isolated, they're uneducated, they are economically disadvantaged. These people seem to be pretty vulnerable. They kind of check all the boxes when it comes to vulnerability. So they definitely seem like easy targets for someone to take advantage of. And you would be right to think that, because in 1962, two brothers named Santos and Cayetano Hernandez suddenly appear in Yerba Buena. And again, everyone knew everyone in this village, so when these brothers arrived, they definitely stuck out. People were like, okay, who are these guys? We've never seen them before. They definitely don't belong here in this little village. And they definitely attracted attention. Is that Santos and Cayetano Hernandez had a lot of experience conning people. They had spent a lot of time traveling around Mexico, committing petty crimes and conning people out of money. It's also been said that the brothers were skilled in amateur magic tricks, and they would sometimes use these tricks to help them in their cons. So one day, Santos and Cayetano are talking, and they decide that they're just kind of bored with these little petty crimes that they've been committing, and they want to do something bigger, something that could be much more lucrative. And that's when they come up with their biggest con yet. So they decide that they are going to try to sell themselves off as prophets. And this is when the brothers managed to stumble upon the teeny tiny village of Yerba Buena. And once they saw the people there and saw how vulnerable and isolated they were, they knew that this would be the perfect place to try to pull this off. So anyways, like I said, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez arrive in Yerba Buena one day, and they walk right into the middle of the village, and immediately people start noticing these two strangers that are suddenly in their town, and they start attracting attention. And before the brothers knew it, they were completely surrounded by the villagers. So everyone in this town is now looking at these guys and wondering what they're doing there. And that's when Santos and Cayetano make this big public announcement that they are prophets of the ancient Incan gods, and they had been sent there to bring a message. And they tell the villagers that if they do everything they're told, that the Incan gods will come down and they will bless them with gold from the mountains. But if anyone doesn't obey, they would be seen as heretics and they would be punished by the gods. There was this widely believed myth at this time, and it even could still be believed today, that there was gold buried in the mountains somewhere. It's also been said that the brothers used their skills with magic to kind of convince the villagers that they were real prophets. And I tried to find out what these tricks were, and I couldn't. All I read was that they used some of these tricks to convince them that they had these supernatural powers. So like I said, there was this myth that there was treasure buried in the mountains, and Santos and Cayetano knew that this myth existed, and so they capitalized on this. They figured that these people, these uneducated people in Yerba Buena, likely believed this myth. And so they used this to their advantage. And so this seems pretty smart, right? However, Santos and Cayetano did not do their due diligence and actually research these gods that they claimed to work for, because if they had, they would have realized that the Incan gods are actually from Peru, which is in South America. The gods that they were actually thinking about were the Aztec gods of Mexico. But despite this discrepancy, it seems as though the villagers didn't even really notice, and they were all on board. So the first thing that the brothers tell the villagers is that the gods require their money and their valuable possessions. And of course, this is usually the first requests in these cults, so this is pretty standard so far. So the villagers happily comply, and they hand over the little amount of money that they had and any valuable possessions that they own. And the villagers also set the brothers up in the nicest hut that they had, which was situated right at the base of one of the caves near the mountains that they lived next to. And they pretty much waited on the brothers 24/7. The brothers didn't have to lift a finger for anything at this point. And again, this is pretty standard cult activity, and I really wish that it had stopped there. But holy shit, do things get dark from here. So, of course, the villagers didn't have a lot of money or valuable possessions, so they handed over everything they had, but this wasn't very much. So right now, the brothers are a little disappointed in their financial gains from this whole thing. So the brothers are like, okay, we're obviously not going to get rich from this whole little scheme. What else can we gain from this? And this is when the brothers come up with a truly disgusting idea. They start handpicking the prettiest girls in the village and then telling their parents that the gods had sent them a message. They tell them that the gods have commanded that they take these girls and teach them all about sex and different sexual acts, and then the girls were to practice these things on the brothers. And this is what they did. They took advantage of these young girls, they sexually abused them repeatedly, and then once the gods and the prophet brothers had decided that the girls were sufficiently educated in the sexual arts, they would then be taken to some of the towns that were closest to Yerba Buena, and they would be sold into sexual slavery. And most of the time, these girls were sold into brothels. And this was another source of income for the brothers. And the girls that I read about were usually between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. And some of this really reminded me of the Tony and Susan Alamo cult case that I did recently. How can any parent or any person in general think that any higher power would want children to be sexually abused? Like, it's just a really hard concept for me to grasp that people could be that brainwashed. And not only were the brothers sexually abusing and sex trafficking these young girls in the cult, they also started taking the women and some of the men and forcing them to be their sex slaves. And the villagers were complying because they were afraid that they would be punished by the gods when they returned. The brothers also started implementing these cave ceremonies, and they were really bizarre. And I do want to give a quick warning here that we will be discussing animal abuse randomly throughout the remainder of this video. So during these cave ceremonies, the brothers would call all of the villagers into the cave near where they were being housed in the hut. Once they were in there would be an altar set up, and the brothers would start chanting. They would also burn incense, and they would begin passing around marijuana. They would also make this tea and put peyote in it. And if you don't know what peyote is, it's like a bluish green cactus that's native to Mexico and the United States, and it's mostly used as a hallucinogenic drug. The brothers would then sacrifice a goat, and they would do this by slitting its throat. And then after the animal sacrifice, that's when the brothers would tell everyone that the gods have commanded them to take part in an orgy. And so all of the villagers and the brothers would then start having this orgy. Keep in mind, this is all going on in a damp, dark cave, which just makes this all creepier to me. So this all goes on for the next few months, and the brothers are living their best lives. They're still being waited on constantly. They are still abusing these young girls. They're still doing these really bizarre cave ceremonies, and they're kind of happy where things are right now. However, the villagers are starting to talk. They're noticing that they're sacrificing all these things, and they're taking part in all these really bizarre rituals, and they're not receiving anything in return. The brothers had promised them that the gods were going to be coming soon, and that they were going to show them where this treasure was as long as they obeyed everything the brothers told them. And they had done what they were supposed to do. They had kept up their end of the bargain, and they're not receiving anything in return. And so the villagers are definitely starting to talk about this. So word of all this doubt gets back to Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, and they're like, okay, we have to figure out a way to rein everyone back in. They didn't want to lose what they had. They weren't gaining a lot financially, but again, they really did like how things were going. They were still being taken care of, and so they didn't want to lose this. So they're like, okay, what can we do to keep these people under our control? So the brothers brainstorm, and they end up coming up with a plan, and they decide that they're going to travel to Monterey and speak to one of their sex trafficking associates named Magdalena Solis. And Eleazar was a local pimp in the Monterey area, and the brothers had actually met Eleazar when they started selling the girls from Yerba Buena into sexual slavery. So yeah, real nice guy. So since Eleazar was a pimp, the brothers knew that he would have access to a lot of women. And part of their plan was to find a woman who was willing to come back to Yerba Buena with them and pretend to be an ancient goddess. This was the idea that they had come up with. They knew that they couldn't produce the treasure that they had promised, but they thought if they could get a woman to come back with them to Yerba Buena and pretend to be a goddess, at least it would show the villagers that they were telling the truth about being prophets and working for the ancient gods. And they just kind of figured that this would at least keep them under their control for now. So after Santos and Cayetano explained the entire scheme to Eleazar Solis, Eleazar is like, I know the perfect employee of mine that could do this. And that employee was his sister. That's right. Eleazar Solis was his sister's pimp. Eleazar's sister's name was Magdalena Solis, and at this time, she's about 18 years old. Unfortunately, we do not know a lot about Magdalena's early life. What we do know is that she did not have a good upbringing, and she was actually forced into sex work at the age of only 12, which is so sad and just really, really messed up. Considering what Magdalena goes on to do in this case, it's safe to say that she must have had some sort of really severe trauma in her life. And of course, being forced into sex work at the age of 12 is insanely traumatic in itself. But I'm wondering if there was something even worse that happened to Magdalena, and you'll know why when you hear the rest of this story. Now, in addition to working as a sex worker for her brother Eleazar, Magdalena herself also took part in various supernatural cons. She would often moonlight as a fortune teller, and she would also sell herself as a medium. And she would claim that she had the ability to communicate with the dead. And she would be hired out quite a bit. And most of the time when people would hire her, it was to contact the spirits of dead witches. And do you see what I mean, that this story was meant to be told in October? And when the brothers found out that Magdalena had experience in these supernatural cons, they were completely sold on her playing this part. And Magdalena herself was all on board. Magdalena being told that she would be able to play the part of this goddess who was worshipped by this entire village, that probably sounded like a way better life than what she was living right now. So I would imagine that she was pretty eager to do this. So once everyone had met and it had been decided that Magdalena was all on board, it was decided that Magdalena was going to play the part of the Aztec goddess Coatlicue. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And this time the brothers did manage to select an Aztec god and not an Incan one, so they did get it right this time. And just a super brief overview of who Coatlicue was. She was the Aztec goddess of the earth as both creator and destroyer, mother of the gods and mortals. Her face is of two-fanged serpents, and her skirt is of interwoven snakes. Snakes are said to symbolize fertility. So the brothers, Magdalena and Eleazar Solis, all ride back to Yerba Buena, and they are getting ready for Magdalena's big debut. And they go all out. They dress her all up to look like an ancient Aztec goddess. She's got the headdress on. She's got the necklace of bones. She definitely looks the part. And somewhere along the line, it was decided that Eleazar Solis, Magdalena's brother, was also going to be included in on this little scheme. And he was going to be playing the part of high priest. And I didn't read this anywhere, but I could imagine Eleazar only allowing Magdalena to be a part of this thing if he could be a part of it as well. He felt like he owned her. So I don't know. I just get the idea that maybe he was like, okay, if she gets to do this, so do I. Like if she's going to go live this awesome life and pretend to be this goddess and be waited on hand and foot, I want in. And that's just me speculating, but I wouldn't be surprised. So yeah, Eleazar's going to play the high priest. Magdalena's going to be the high priestess and goddess Coatlicue. And the brothers are going to continue their role as the prophets to the ancient gods. And at this point, the plan was that the brothers were still calling all the shots. They were still in charge of this cult. They just needed Magdalena to help them keep everyone under control. They still wanted to be the ultimate final decision makers in the cult. So that's how things are at this point. But spoiler, Magdalena ends up having her own idea of how this is all going to play out. So it's the night of the big reveal, and everyone in town has been summoned to the cave for one of their normal cave ceremony things that they do, just like they had been summoned so many nights before. Except this night, the villagers were going to leave the ceremony feeling like all their sacrifices and all their participation in these bizarre rituals were actually paying off. So all the villagers, of course, come into the cave, and the brothers are up at the altar, and they begin doing their normal chanting, and they burn their incense, they prepare the marijuana and the peyote tea, and everything seems to be going like it normally does. But then a third man appears, a man that no one in the cult had ever seen before. He goes up to the altar with the brothers, and he makes this announcement to the cult that he is a high priest of the ancient goddess Coatlicue. And then suddenly everyone hears this super loud noise, and then a huge thick cloud of smoke appears. And as the smoke begins to clear, they can see a woman emerging. And the villagers are watching this all happen in total disbelief. And when the smoke finally did clear, they believed that they were looking at an ancient goddess, just like the brothers had promised. They were so happy because they thought, okay, finally the gods are returning, just like the brothers said. They're returning so that they can reward the people who had obeyed everything, and they can punish the heretics. And once again, the brothers' knowledge of cheap tricks ends up paying off for them, because the big cloud of mystical smoke that the villagers had seen was actually just flash powder that had been ignited at just the right time. And once Coatlicue had emerged and the villagers saw her, they just dropped to their knees and they just began bowing down to her. And the brothers were so happy with how this all went went down. But little did they know how crazy things were about to get. All the orgies and the animal sacrifices would seem so tame compared to what Magdalena goes on to do. So as the days go on, Magdalena is kind of keeping with those same rituals that the brothers had already established. She's calling everyone for these cave ceremonies every couple of days. They're still doing the same thing with the peyote tea. They are still having these crazy orgies. All that stuff's still going on. She's also still doing the animal sacrifices, and she's even participating in the sexual abuse that's been going on in the cult. Magdalena started taking sex slaves for herself, and the villagers were worshiping her and tending to her every need. And eventually all the worship and the attention that the villagers were giving Magdalena started to go to her head. She started to actually believe that she truly was an ancient goddess. So like I said earlier, when Magdalena and Eleazar got involved in the cult, it was decided that the brothers would still be making all the decisions. They would still truly be the ones in charge. That's how things started. But the more Magdalena was being worshipped by the villagers, the more she started to believe she truly was a goddess, and it really started going to her head, and she completely stopped listening to the brothers, and she completely stopped listening to her own brother. And honestly, knowing what we know about Magdalena's life before the cult, knowing that she was forced into sex work when she was just 12 years old, she's always been taken advantage of. She's always been the one that was never in control. She was always being controlled by someone. So I'm sure that this probably felt good to her. This was probably the first time in her life where she was the one that was in control. She was the one being worshipped. She was the one getting all the attention. And I'm sure she probably liked that feeling. And she started to realize just how powerful her control over the cult was. She started to realize that no matter what she told the villagers to do, they would do it without question. So if she told them to go kill someone like Santos and Cayetano or her brother Eleazar, she was pretty confident that she could get them to do that. So Magdalena had no fear of them anymore. She was going to be in charge of this thing now, and there was nothing that they could do about it. She had an entire army of villagers on her side. So yeah, the brothers kind of screwed themselves here. I don't think they were anticipating this power trip that Magdalena was going to go on. And once Magdalena fully realized the control that she had over the cult, she started to add her own perversions into the rituals. And if you thought shit was wild before, just prepare yourselves. Instead of making peyote tea like they had been doing, Magdalena now decided that she is going to use blood. So she begins cutting herself and draining her own blood into this like ceremonial chalice, and she would drain her blood into this chalice, and that's what she would mix the peyote with. And then she would drink from this cup, and then she would pass the cup around to the villagers. And this is when the vampire-y acts kind of start. And this is also why I told you probably shouldn't drink anything red while you're listening to this video. And Magdalena told the villagers that they should drink this to give them magical powers and help them to become immortal. So yeah, the villagers would just pass this around and they'd guzzle this blood down. And once they were sufficiently tripping on peyote, they would do the orgy thing. And Magdalena added her own twist here as well. And the next part I'm about to tell you is really messed up, and I'm really sorry. So during these orgies, Magdalena would force the villagers into committing incest, bestiality, and pedophilia while she watched. And she was obviously getting some sort of sexual gratification out of watching this. And it could have even just been sexual gratification over the power that she had. Like maybe she was getting off on all this power that she suddenly had. And now she knew she could make these people do whatever she wanted. If she could get them to participate in pedophilia and incest and bestiality, she felt like she could probably get them to do anything. Because I'm going to go out on a limb and say these villagers probably had never participated in anything like this before. She knew she had complete control over this cult, and I think she got off on that. But anyways, this all goes on for a few weeks, and then a couple of villagers get to talking, and they decide that they don't really like how things are going. They're not really seeing any gains from this, and they're starting to feel gross about some of the things that they're participating in. Things were just getting a little too bizarre for them, and so they start to vocalize this to some of the other cult members. And then word of this eventually gets back to Magdalena herself, and she is not happy. How dare these peasant mortals question the ancient Aztec goddess? So Magdalena decided that it was up to her to punish the heretics. And so she kind of decided that she wanted to make an example out of these two people. And she ended up ordering the village to lynch these two people to death. Two of their own. Two of the people that they had come up in this communal farm with. They lynched them to death on Magdalena's order. Just like that. I mean, it was just her giving the order, and without question, these people turned on their own. So yeah, the villagers just beat these two people to death right there in front of Magdalena, Eleazar, and the Hernandez brothers. And sadly, these are just the first of many murders that were to come in the following weeks. And unfortunately, Magdalena seemed to really enjoy watching these people get murdered. So now it was decided that instead of animal sacrifices during the rituals, they would now have human sacrifices. Magdalena said that now human sacrifices were needed to appease the gods. I have read from some sources that the sacrifices were picked at random. Other sources say that they weren't random, that they were actually people who were thought to be questioning Magdalena and the cult and maybe considering leaving. And I don't really know which one is right, but I'm leaning more towards them being chosen at random. I just can't see that many people vocalizing any doubts that they had when they're seeing these people being killed and sacrificed. But either way, no matter how they were chosen to be sacrificed, it is known that they would most of the time be beaten almost to death, and then the villagers would take turns stabbing them or burning them. And then typically once they were dead, their bodies would be dismembered. The people that are being sacrificed have family members within this cult, and their own family members are turning on them. They know that if one of their family members are chosen to be the sacrifice, that they must without question turn on them and kill them. It's just so messed up to think about, because these are husbands and wives, brothers and sisters. It's just crazy that these people were this brainwashed, that they were doing these things. And it's even crazier that Magdalena and the Hernandez brothers and Eleazar were all four so evil that they could watch these things happen. And once Magdalena switched to human sacrifices in these rituals, Magdalena stopped cutting herself in the ritual. She actually started using the blood from the victims. And what they would do is, once the victim was dead, they would drain them of all their blood and they would collect them in these chalices, and then they would mix the blood with chicken blood and peyote. And that's what would be passed around the cave to all the cult members. And then afterwards, they would engage in these orgies. And again, I just want to point out that this is all happening in a dark, damp, creepy cave. And that seriously just, it sounds like something from a horror film. And guys, just when you thought things couldn't get more fucked up, Magdalena then starts ripping the hearts out of these victims. And it's been reported that some of these people were still alive when she did this. This pattern just keeps repeating itself. All of these cave rituals and the sacrificing, all of that stuff keeps going on for a while. And we actually don't know how many people were sacrificed in the end. We know that it's at least 6, but it's been reported that it could be up to like 15 or 16 people. So now we're going to jump slightly ahead, and now Magdalena has been in power for about 6 weeks. You heard that right, 6 weeks. This has all progressed to the point of ripping people's hearts from their chests in a matter of 6 weeks. So one day in May of 1963, it's been about 6 weeks into Magdalena's reign, a 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero just happened to be wandering around the area. And Sebastian was not affiliated with Yerba Buena in any way. He didn't know any of the things that were going on there. He just happened to be wandering around the area. While he's wandering around the Yerba Buena area, he can see some lights flickering in the distance inside a cave near the mountains. This piqued his interest. This was out of the norm, and it was something that he felt like he needed to go investigate. So that's what he does. He goes to the cave, and as he's approaching the cave, he starts to hear some really weird noises that he later described as sounding part human and part like wild animal. He continues to make his way into the cave, and when he finally does manage to get in, he can see that there are people in there, and he kind of wants to stay hidden, so he finds a rock and he hides behind it. And he's just watching and trying to figure out what he's seeing, because he's seeing something weird, but his brain is having a hard time computing what it is he's actually seeing. And what Sebastian was witnessing was one of the cave ceremonies, and he sees a woman standing near an altar holding what appeared to be a heart. He also sees a bunch of people on the ground in the cave engaging in all kind of sexual acts. He also sees some of the people passing around something that looks like blood, and they're drinking it. And then Sebastian sees something laying on the altar, and he realizes that this is a dismembered body that he's looking at. He's kind of starting to put things together, and he's realizing what the people were drinking in this chalice was blood, and it was coming from this person. So once Sebastian manages to figure out what it is that he's looking at, he panics and he takes off running, and he does not stop running until he comes to the closest police station. Yerba Buena is a pretty isolated area, and the nearest police station was 15 miles away. And it's been reported that Sebastian started running from that cave and he didn't stop until he arrived at the police station. And so the nearest town that had a police station was called Villagran. And so he runs into the station and he starts frantically telling the story of what he had just seen. And at first the officers don't believe him. Their instinct is to kind of blow this off because it just sounds way too far-fetched. But Sebastian was very persistent, and they could tell that he was legitimately scared. One of the officers, named Luis Martinez, decided that he is going to volunteer to go with Sebastian and go check this out. He and Sebastian end up getting in his cop car and they head over to Yerba Buena. And after about a day or so, the officers in Villagran realize that they have not seen Officer Luis Martinez in a couple of days, and they're starting to get a little worried. So once they realize that they hadn't seen Luis in a while, they decide to contact the state capitol, and it's decided that an investigation was going to be launched into his disappearance. And as part of the investigation, they decide that they're going to start asking some questions about the village of Yerba Buena. So they start asking around the local area. Again, Yerba Buena is pretty isolated, but there are some border towns. So they start questioning people around these towns just to kind of get a feel of if anyone knew of anything weird going on in that area. They started hearing some pretty troubling rumors. The people that were questioned started telling the officers that they had heard rumors of ancient ceremonies and devil worship that was going on in the town. So now the officers are really panicking because now they're realizing that Sebastian was telling the truth. So the officers don't waste any time. They end up contacting the military, and they get some of the army out to help them. And then a huge group of officers plus the military end up going straight into Yerba Buena. And when they arrive, they head straight for the farmhouse that Magdalena and her brother Eleazar had been living in. And when they busted through the door, they find Eleazar and Magdalena in bed, and they are completely wasted on drugs. And then they also see Santos Hernandez. He knew what was going on. He knew that they were being raided, so he decided he was going to take off. So while some of the officers were apprehending Magdalena and Eleazar, other officers started pursuing Santos as he was escaping the house. And then a shootout started. During the shootout, the police end up shooting and killing Santos. And sadly, when the officers started searching around the property, they did end up finding the bodies of Sebastian Guerrero and Officer Luis Martinez. And both of them had been completely brutalized, and Officer Martinez's heart had been ripped from his chest. We've got Magdalena, we've got Eleazar, they're in custody. We know Santos is now dead. He was killed during the shootout. where is Cayetano? He's the last one. Where is he? Well, during the search of the property, the police end up finding Cayetano's body, and he had been murdered by one of the cult members. This man's name was Jesus Rubio, and he found out what Magdalena and Eleazar and the Hernandez brothers had been doing. He found out that they had just been lying and taking advantage of the village. You're probably thinking that he killed him out of revenge, right? Because that's what I thought when I first read it. But no, he actually killed him because when he found out that they were lying to the village, he wanted in on it. He went to Cayetano and he's like, look, I'm not going to tell anyone that this is all a big lie as long as you cut me in. You let me be a part of this too. And Cayetano said no, so that's when Jesus Rubio ended up killing Cayetano. And of course, after all the dust had finally settled and all this, the police did go in and do a thorough search of Yerba Buena, and they did go into the cave where all the ceremonies took place, and they found evidence to back up everything Sebastian had said. And they also found the bodies of 6 more victims that had been dismembered and just left in the caves. So in addition to Magdalena and Eleazar Solis being arrested, some of the villagers were also arrested. And when Magdalena and Eleazar were put on trial, the prosecutors approached some of the cult members, some of the villagers, and asked them to be witnesses against Magdalena and Eleazar, and no one would do this. They all said no. So they were still not willing to turn on Magdalena or Eleazar, and I don't know if it was out of loyalty or out of fear. And because of this, the only murders that Magdalena and Eleazar could be tried for were the murders of Sebastian Guerrero and Officer Luis Martinez. And they were tried and they were both found guilty, and they were sentenced to 50 years in prison. And the villagers that were arrested were also put on trial for gang murders and lynching, and they were all found guilty, and each of them were sentenced to 30 years in prison. So Magdalena would technically have been released in 2013. That would have been 50 years for her. But I searched and searched and I couldn't find any updated information on Magdalena at all, but it has been speculated that she died in prison while she was serving her sentence. And that was the gruesome, disturbing, absolutely awful case of Magdalena Solis and her vampire cult. And if you found this video interesting and you're into true crime or cults or heinous history, please consider subscribing to my channel. And I do have at least one more Halloween-ish video to upload for this month, but I'm hoping to squeeze in one more. And if you don't subscribe, maybe just come visit my channel in the next couple of weeks so you don't miss out on that content. Anyways, that's all for me today. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.